So if you think about trying to stay sober for the rest of your life, you're going to lose your mind. And that doesn't feel good. So what do you do instead? You bring it back to the old one day at a time. All right. So bring it back to one day at a time. You can do anything for one day. Um, you can stay sober today. Okay. You can do that. And when you bring it back to one day at a time, it really does make it a whole lot less overwhelming and a lot more, it makes it seem a lot more manageable in your mind and doable. Like, yeah, I could do one day. And, and so bring it back to one day at a time. And then if you want to stay sober today, let's think about what are some things you could do to stay sober. There's that old adage, meeting makers make it, which I think it's not true, but it's true, but it's not true. Meeting makers don't make it. Meeting makers make it, but meeting makers who go to meetings and also work the steps stay sober. So you gotta, meeting makers make it, but those ones who do the steps, so you gotta do both. You gotta do the steps, and you gotta go to meetings regularly. And I think one of the reasons why, if you go to meetings today, you're gonna stay sober today, most likely, is because you're gonna go to a meeting and you're gonna hear things. You're gonna hear what it was like, and it's gonna scare you, and it's gonna remind you of what it's like out there, and remind you how bad it gets, and it's gonna motivate you to want to stay sober that day. You're gonna be grateful that you're sober today. Oh man, I'm so grateful I'm sober today. And then you're and it's going to motivate you naturally, just sort of naturally. You're going to want to stay sober because you're like, oh my god, you hear all these horror stories of what it was like when you go to a meeting, and then you're like, god, I want to stay sober today. And then you stay sober that day. And then, but you also hear this other pillar on the other end when you go to a meeting, where you hear what it's like now, right? And that motivates you and inspires you to want to stay sober that day. So when you go to meetings regularly, you're consistently hearing what happened, what it was like, and it scares you, and it reminds you what it's like. And then you're also hearing what it's like now, and you're hearing the opposite end of how it's positively impacted and changed people's lives to get sober. And you hear that regularly and on a daily basis, and it makes you want to stay sober that day. And if you go to a meeting that day, if you go to meetings regularly in your sobriety, you stay present to all that stuff, and you naturally, almost effortlessly, stay sober one day at a time. And so, to me, if you want to stay sober for the rest of your life, I only have 8 years of sobriety. I think that's a long time, but I also think it's not a long time. This has been my strategy, and I think when people don't stay sober for a long time, you'll notice in the meetings you hear that they stopped going to meetings. And I think what happens is, when you stop going to meetings regularly, let's not even say every day, let's just say regularly. Like, if I don't go to a meeting for a month, which I have done, I almost completely forget what happened, what it was like, what it's like now. I completely forget, and I go right back to the same guy mentally that I was when I had an addiction. So I just forget about it completely, and it makes sense that a person would relapse, or is more susceptible to relapse, when they stop going to meetings regularly and they stop doing the steps. So remember, if you want to stay sober for a long time, don't think about the rest of your life, because you're going to lose your mind. But then bring it back to one day at a time. What could I do to stay sober today? Well, go to a meeting. Go to meetings regularly. Hear what it was like and what happened, so that it reminds you of how bad it gets, and it motivates you to want to stay sober today. And then you hear what it's like now, and that motivates you to want to stay sober today. And so you can go to meetings regularly. You can do the steps regularly. You can meditate. You can try to help people and be of service in a way that's meaningful. You can meditate. You can put your resentments down on paper. You can get rid of your resentments. You can make amends when you're wrong. You can do a lot of things to stay sober today, to make it more likely that you stay sober. And I think the winning game plan is bringing it back the winning game plan to stay sober for a long time and not have to worry and fear about, oh God, how am I going to stay sober for so long, is to bring it back to one day at a time, go to meetings regularly, and do the steps. And do all those steps that you know you should be doing, especially writing resentments down, especially keeping your side of the street clean, and doing those 10 steps. And going to meetings regularly, because again, that's going to keep you present to what it was like and what happened and how bad it gets, and it's going to inspire you and remind you of what it's like now to stay sober. So I think that's really the winning game plan for trying to stay sober and not having to fear, as almost like an antidote or a solution to when we do get in that place of being afraid of, oh God, how am I going to stay sober for the rest of my life? So just bring it back to one day at a time. Stay sober today. Go to a meeting today. You're going to hear how crappy, how painful it gets out there, and what it's like now. And it's going to really motivate you and inspire you almost naturally to stay sober today. So I hope that helps you. I'll see you next time.